The rain drummed steadily against the windows of Portland International Airport on November 24, 1971, the day before Thanksgiving. Outside, the Pacific Northwest sky hung heavy and gray, pregnant with the promise of more storms to come. Inside the busy terminal, holiday travelers rushed past each other with barely a glance, their minds focused on family gatherings and turkey dinners waiting at their destinations. None of them could have imagined that they were about to witness the beginning of America's greatest unsolved mystery. Among the crowd of travelers stood a man who would soon become a legend, though no one paid him any attention that afternoon. He was unremarkable in every way that mattered to the casual observer. Middle-aged, perhaps in his 40s, with dark hair neatly combed and a face that seemed designed to blend into any crowd. He wore a business suit, dark and conservative, the kind worn by countless salesmen and office workers across the country. A white shirt, a narrow black tie, and a raincoat completed his outfit. Everything about him screamed ordinary, forgettable, safe. But there was something in his eyes, perhaps, or in the way he carried himself, that suggested depths beneath the surface. He moved with quiet confidence, the kind that comes from careful planning and absolute certainty. In his hand, he carried a brown paper bag and a black attaché case. To anyone watching, he looked like just another businessman heading home for the holiday. His name, he would tell the airline staff, was Dan Cooper. The media would later mistakenly call him D.B. Cooper, and the name would stick like glue to the American imagination. But on that rainy afternoon, he was simply another passenger purchasing a one-way ticket on Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 305, bound for Seattle. The fare was just $12.04, a modest price for what would become the most expensive airplane ride in American history. At exactly 2:50 in the afternoon, Flight 305 pushed back from the gate. The aircraft was a Boeing 727-100, registration number N467US, a workhorse of the skies that had been flying passengers safely for years. The 727 was particularly well suited for Cooper's purposes, though he couldn't have known it at the time. Unlike most modern aircraft, it featured a unique design element: aft stairs that could be lowered during flight, creating an exit at the rear of the plane. It was a feature that would prove crucial to the events that followed. The flight carried 36 passengers that day, a light load for the holiday season. Most were traveling to Seattle for Thanksgiving celebrations, their conversations filled with plans for family dinners and long weekends. The crew consisted of Captain William Scott, a veteran pilot with thousands of hours of flying experience, First Officer William Radizak, younger but equally skilled, and Flight Engineer Harold Anderson, responsible for monitoring the aircraft's complex systems. The cabin crew included Head Flight Attendant Florence Schaffner and her colleague Alice Hancock, both experienced professionals who had handled countless flights and knew how to keep passengers comfortable and safe. Cooper settled into seat 18C, an aisle seat toward the rear of the aircraft. He was polite and quiet, ordering bourbon and soda when the beverage service began. Florence Schaffner would later remember serving him, noting that he seemed calm and well-mannered. He didn't drink much, just sipped at his cocktail while gazing out the window at the cloud-covered landscape below. To all appearances, he was simply another businessman lost in thought as the plane climbed through the stormy skies above Oregon. The flight proceeded normally for the first 20 minutes. Passengers read magazines, dozed, or chatted quietly with their neighbors. The aircraft climbed steadily through the turbulent air, seeking smoother conditions above the weather. In the cockpit, the crew monitored their instruments and communicated with air traffic control, following the routine procedures they had practiced thousands of times before. It was then that Dan Cooper made his move. Florence Schaffner was walking down the aisle, checking on passengers and collecting empty glasses, when Cooper quietly called her over. She approached with the professional smile that all flight attendants master, expecting perhaps a request for another drink or a question about arrival time. Instead, Cooper leaned close and spoke in a voice so calm it sent chills down her spine. "Miss, I have a bomb." For a moment, the words didn't register. Schaffner had heard all kinds of strange comments from passengers over the years, and her first instinct was to assume this was some kind of inappropriate joke. She started to walk away, but Cooper's voice stopped her cold. "Miss, you'd better look at this." He opened his attaché case just enough for her to see inside, and what she saw there would haunt her for the rest of her life. Tangled masses of wires, red cylinders that looked unmistakably like dynamite, and what appeared to be a battery, all packed carefully into the case. The device looked crude but deadly, the kind of improvised explosive that could easily blow a hole in the aircraft's hull. Schaffner's professional training kicked in immediately. Years of safety instruction had prepared her for many emergencies, but nothing quite like this. She forced herself to remain calm, knowing that panic would only make the situation worse for everyone aboard. Her voice barely above a whisper, she asked Cooper what he wanted. Cooper's response was delivered in the same calm, almost conversational tone that would characterize all his interactions that day. He wanted her to sit down next to him, he said, and he wanted her to write down exactly what he was about to tell her. With trembling hands, Schaffner took out a notepad and pen, trying to appear normal to the other passengers while her heart pounded in her chest. Cooper's demands were specific and well thought out. He wanted $200,000 in $20 bills, and he wanted 4 parachutes, 2 main chutes and 2 reserves. The money was to be delivered in a canvas bank bag, and the parachutes were to be of civilian, not military, type. He gave her detailed instructions about serial numbers and specifications, demonstrating a knowledge that suggested careful research and planning. But perhaps most remarkably, Cooper's manner throughout this conversation remained almost courteous. He never raised his voice, never made threats beyond the obvious one implied by the bomb. He even offered to pay for Schaffner's drink, a gesture so absurdly polite under the circumstances that it would become part of the Cooper legend. When she asked him if she should tell the captain, he nodded and suggested she do so quickly. Schaffner made her way to the cockpit, her legs unsteady beneath her. Captain Scott listened to her report with the calm professionalism that had served him well through decades of flying. He immediately contacted air traffic control, using coded language to alert authorities without causing panic among the passengers. The phrase, "We have a problem," was enough to set in motion a carefully rehearsed emergency response. Within minutes, word of the hijacking had reached the highest levels of both Northwest Orient Airlines and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In an era when airline security consisted of little more than metal detectors that passengers could choose to avoid, hijackings were becoming an increasingly common problem. But most hijackers wanted to go to Cuba or make political statements. Cooper's demands suggested something different, something unprecedented. Northwest Orient's president, Donald Nyrop, was contacted at his home and immediately authorized payment of the ransom. The airline's policy was clear. Passenger safety came first, corporate profits second. If Cooper wanted $200,000, he would get it. The FBI, meanwhile, began mobilizing resources for what would become one of the longest and most intensive investigations in the agency's history. Back on the aircraft, Cooper settled in to wait. He ordered another bourbon and soda, chatting casually with Schaffner about her job and her life. Other passengers remained unaware of the drama unfolding around them, told only that there would be a delay in Seattle due to minor mechanical difficulties. Cooper seemed genuinely interested in Schaffner's stories about her work as a flight attendant, asking questions about her routes and experiences with an almost fatherly concern. The flight attendant would later describe Cooper as the most polite hijacker she could imagine. He apologized for the inconvenience he was causing, expressed concern for the passengers' comfort, and even offered to request that the airline compensate everyone for the delay. It was as if he viewed the hijacking as simply a business transaction, regrettable but necessary, and he wanted to conduct it with as much civility as possible. As Flight 305 approached Seattle, Cooper made another request that demonstrated his careful planning. He asked Schaffner to lower the aft stairs once they were on the ground, but not before. This detail suggested that Cooper was familiar with the Boeing 727's unique capabilities, knowledge that would later fuel speculation about his background and profession. The aircraft touched down at Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at 5:39 p.m., nearly 3 hours after takeoff. By then, the airport was swarming with FBI agents, police officers, and airline officials. Fire trucks and ambulances stood by, their crews ready for any emergency. But Cooper had given strict instructions: no unusual activity around the aircraft, no obvious law enforcement presence, and absolutely no attempt to storm the plane. The passengers were told they could deplane to stretch their legs during the refueling stop, and most took advantage of the opportunity. As they filed off the aircraft, none suspected that they were leaving behind one of the most audacious criminals in American history. Cooper remained seated, still sipping his bourbon, still chatting pleasantly with the flight crew. The money arrived in a canvas bank bag, just as Cooper had requested. $200,000 in $20 bills, each one carefully photographed and cataloged by FBI agents. The serial numbers were recorded, creating a paper trail that investigators hoped would eventually lead them to Cooper. The bills were not marked or treated with any kind of tracing compound, a decision that would later be criticized but which reflected the priority placed on passenger safety. The parachutes took longer to locate. Cooper had specifically requested civilian models, not the military versions that might have been easier to obtain. A local skydiving instructor was contacted and asked to provide the equipment, though he was not told why it was needed. The parachutes he delivered were in good condition, properly packed and ready for use. Cooper examined both the money and the parachutes carefully, displaying a knowledge that impressed even the experienced flight crew. He counted the bills methodically, checking their condition and authenticity. He inspected the parachutes with the eye of someone who understood the equipment, testing the harnesses and examining the canopies. Satisfied with both, he made his final demand. The aircraft was to take off again, bound for Mexico City, but with specific flight parameters. Cooper wanted the plane to fly at low altitude, no higher than 10,000 feet, and at the slowest possible speed without stalling. The landing gear was to remain down, and the wing flaps were to be lowered to their maximum setting. These requirements would make the flight much more dangerous and fuel-intensive, but they would also make it possible for someone to jump from the aircraft and survive. Captain Scott tried to explain the dangers of Cooper's plan. Flying at such low altitude in the mountainous terrain of southwestern Washington would be extremely hazardous, especially in the stormy weather conditions. The configuration Cooper demanded would severely limit the aircraft's performance and handling characteristics. But Cooper was adamant, and with a bomb still on board, the crew had no choice but to comply. At 7:40 p.m., Flight 305 took off from Seattle for the second time that day. This time, it carried only Cooper and the 6 crew members, flying into a night that would become legendary in American folklore. The passenger cabin was eerily quiet, with only the sound of the engines and the storm outside to break the silence. Cooper asked flight engineer Anderson to show him how to operate the aft stairs, claiming he needed to understand the mechanism for his escape. Anderson reluctantly complied, explaining the controls and safety procedures while hoping desperately that Cooper would reconsider his plan. The weather outside was brutal, with freezing rain, high winds, and zero visibility. Jumping into such conditions would be virtual suicide. But Cooper seemed determined to proceed. He removed his business suit jacket and tie, keeping only his shirt and trousers. The black J.C. Penney tie he left behind would later provide investigators with crucial DNA evidence, though it would take decades for the technology to become available. He strapped on one of the parachutes, adjusting the harness with practiced ease, and secured the money bag to his body. As the aircraft flew south through the storm, Cooper made his way to the aft section of the plane. The crew had been ordered to remain in the cockpit with the door closed, so his final moments aboard the aircraft were witnessed by no one. At approximately 8 p.m., somewhere over the dense forests of southwestern Washington, Dan Cooper lowered the aft stairs and stepped into history. The crew felt the aircraft shudder as the stairs deployed, followed by a slight upward movement as Cooper's weight left the plane. Captain Scott immediately contacted air traffic control to report that the hijacker had jumped, but by then Cooper was already plummeting through the darkness toward the forest below. What happened next remains one of America's greatest mysteries. Cooper jumped into a raging storm, wearing only a business suit and carrying 48 pounds of cash, over terrain so rugged that search teams would have difficulty reaching it even in good weather. The temperature outside was well below freezing, with winds gusting up to 70 miles per hour. He jumped at night, in zero visibility, over an area covered with dense forest and steep ravines. The FBI launched the most extensive investigation in the agency's history, assigning hundreds of agents to what they codenamed NORJAC, for Northwest Hijacking. They interviewed hundreds of suspects, followed thousands of leads, and spent countless hours combing through the forests of Washington and Oregon. Despite their efforts, no trace of Cooper was found for nearly a decade. In 1980, an 8-year-old boy named Brian Ingram was playing along the banks of the Columbia River when he discovered something extraordinary. Buried in the sand were several bundles of decomposed $20 bills, their serial numbers matching those given to Cooper 9 years earlier. The discovery represented the only confirmed physical evidence from the hijacking ever found outside the aircraft, and it raised more questions than it answered. How had the money traveled from the suspected jump zone to the Columbia River? Why were only some of the bills found? And where was the rest of the ransom? The decomposed condition of the currency suggested it had been in the elements for years, but the bills were still bundled together, implying they hadn't been scattered by wind or water. The mystery deepened rather than resolved. Over the decades that followed, Cooper became a folk hero, a gentleman bandit who had pulled off the perfect crime. Books were written about him, documentaries produced, and movies made. He inspired countless imitators, though none achieved his level of success or notoriety. The case generated thousands of tips and confessions, but none led to Cooper's identification or capture. The black tie Cooper removed before jumping provided investigators with a DNA sample, offering hope that modern forensic techniques might finally solve the case. But despite advances in DNA analysis and facial reconstruction technology, Cooper's identity remains unknown. The FBI officially suspended active investigation of the case in 2016, though they continue to review any significant evidence that emerges. The debate over Cooper's fate continues to this day. Did he survive the jump and disappear with the money, living out his days in comfortable anonymity? Or did he perish in the forest that night, a victim of his own audacious plan? The evidence suggests both possibilities, and perhaps that's exactly what Cooper intended. Those who believe Cooper died point to the harsh conditions of the jump, his apparent lack of skydiving experience based on his parachute choices, and the discovery of the deteriorated money. The odds of surviving such a jump, they argue, were virtually zero. Cooper's body and parachute may still lie somewhere in the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest, hidden beneath decades of fallen leaves and undergrowth. But others insist that Cooper's careful planning and apparent knowledge of aviation suggest he was more capable than he appeared. His polite demeanor and calm confidence implied a man who knew exactly what he was doing. Perhaps he had planned an escape route, a place to hide the money and disappear into a new identity. Perhaps he's still alive somewhere, an elderly man with the ultimate secret. The case has spawned dozens of theories and hundreds of suspects. Some investigators believe Cooper was an aerospace employee who used his knowledge of aircraft to plan the perfect heist. Others suspect he was a military veteran, possibly a paratrooper, who understood both flying and jumping. Still others think he was simply a desperate man who got lucky, pulling off an impossible crime through audacity and chance. What makes the D.B. Cooper case so enduring is not just the mystery of his identity or fate, but what he represents in American culture. He committed a serious federal crime, endangered the lives of innocent people, and caused widespread fear in an era when airline security was already a growing concern. Yet he did it all with such style, such courtesy, such apparent concern for his victims, that he became a romantic figure rather than a villain. Cooper never hurt anyone during the hijacking. He was polite to the crew, considerate of the passengers, and almost apologetic about the inconvenience he was causing. He dressed well, spoke respectfully, and conducted himself with a dignity that seems impossible under the circumstances. In an era of increasing violence in America, Cooper represented a gentler kind of rebellion, a crime committed with class. The flight crew members who interacted with Cooper that day have all passed away now, taking their first-hand memories of the mysterious hijacker with them. Florence Schaffner, the flight attendant who bore the brunt of Cooper's attention, lived with the memory of that afternoon for the rest of her life. She described him as the most unforgettable passenger she ever served, a man whose politeness made his crime all the more surreal. The Boeing 727 that carried Cooper on his final flight, N467 US, continued in service for many years before eventually being retired. The aircraft became something of a celebrity itself, with aviation enthusiasts seeking it out at air shows and museums. The aft stairs that Cooper used for his escape were eventually modified on all 727s, making it impossible to lower them during flight. The Cooper case had literally changed the design of commercial aircraft. Modern airline security, with its extensive screening procedures and federal air marshals, makes a Cooper-style hijacking virtually impossible today. The casual approach to aviation security that existed in 1971 seems almost quaint by contemporary standards. Cooper succeeded partly because he chose the perfect moment in history, when airline security was minimal but aircraft design still offered opportunities for escape. The money Cooper stole would be worth well over $1 million in today's currency, making it one of the most expensive unsolved crimes in American history. But the real cost of the Cooper case can't be measured in dollars alone. It changed how Americans think about air travel, crime, and the possibility of the perfect heist. It created a legend that has endured for more than half a century, inspiring countless books, movies, and conversations. Every year on November 24th, Cooper enthusiasts gather to commemorate the anniversary of the hijacking. They share theories, examine evidence, and keep the mystery alive for new generations. The case has its own annual conference, dedicated websites, and passionate amateur investigators who continue searching for clues that might finally solve the puzzle. Some of these amateur sleuths claim to have identified Cooper, presenting elaborate theories based on circumstantial evidence and speculation. But none have provided the definitive proof that would satisfy investigators or close the case. Cooper's true identity remains as elusive today as it was on that stormy night in 1971 when he vanished into the darkness. The forests of southwestern Washington still hold their secrets. Somewhere in those dense woods, among the towering Douglas firs and deep ravines, the answer to the Cooper mystery may still be waiting. Perhaps a hiker will stumble upon a parachute tangled in the branches, or construction workers will uncover a cache of rotting $20 bills. Or perhaps Cooper's secret will remain buried forever, leaving future generations to wonder about the polite gentleman who pulled off the crime of the century. In the end, the D.B. Cooper case represents something uniquely American: the belief that one person with careful planning and audacious courage can outwit the system and disappear into legend. Whether Cooper lived or died, succeeded or failed, he achieved a kind of immortality that most people only dream of. He became a story that will be told as long as people are fascinated by mystery, adventure, and the tantalizing possibility that sometimes, just sometimes, the perfect crime really is possible. The man who called himself Dan Cooper boarded Flight 305 as an ordinary passenger and left it as a legend. In the space of a few hours, he transformed from an anonymous face in the crowd to one of the most famous unknown people in American history. His story continues to captivate us because it represents the ultimate mystery, not just what happened to him, but who he really was, and whether somewhere out there, an elderly man still smiles when he hears his old alias mentioned on the news. As the years pass and the case grows colder, the legend of D.B. Cooper only grows stronger. He has become more than just a criminal. He's become a symbol of the mystery and possibility that still exist in our increasingly connected and surveilled world. In an age when privacy is disappearing and every movement is tracked, Cooper represents the tantalizing hope that it's still possible to vanish completely, to escape into anonymity and leave the world wondering. That stormy Thanksgiving Eve in 1971, when Dan Cooper stepped out of Flight 305 and into the darkness, he didn't just disappear from the aircraft. He disappeared into the realm of legend, where fact blends with fiction and the impossible becomes possible. And there, in that misty borderland between truth and myth, D.B. Cooper will remain forever America's most polite hijacker and greatest unsolved mystery.